As the Israeli state accelerates its latest genocidal plan, there's no better person to speak to than the always brilliant Mouin Rabbani, who's an incredible Palestinian Dutch analyst, also the co-editor of Jadalia, as well as wearing lots of other hats. Brilliant analyst. Many of you would have watched the interviews we've done here with him before. So I'm telling you the truth. Great to speak to you as ever. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Owen, and also for your kind words of introduction. You've set the bar very high.
Never disappointed, though. Comments always show, and as we'll see in this particular interview. So Israel originally on Friday announced a plan calling for a full-scale occupation of Gaza. As lots of people will be aware, Gaza's always been under Israeli occupation since 1967. The Israeli army disengaged in 2005, but it was legally under occupation because they controlled land, sea, air, communication, civil registry, and so on. What we're talking about is what is a full-scale assault on Gaza City, Mawasi, and the central camps. Could you tell me, what does this mean in practice? People hear full-scale occupation and they'll go, well, Gaza's been essentially wiped from the face of the earth as is. What else could they be planning?
Well, it's a very good question. Just to recap, as you pointed out, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip in June of 1967. It was in full and direct physical control of the entire territory until 1994, when, in the context of the Oslo agreements and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, it redeployed, in its own words, from much of the Gaza Strip, although formally, of course, it remained in occupied territory. Then in 2005, in the context of what Israel called the unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip, it dismantled its settlements and military bases that remained within the Gaza Strip, and withdrew its forces to the boundaries of the Gaza Strip. International consensus, including by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is a custodian of the Geneva Conventions, was that Israel remained the occupying power in the Gaza Strip because it continued to control the borders, the airspace, the territorial waters, the electromagnetic sphere, and was able to strictly control what entered and exited the Gaza Strip. Now, beginning in late 2023, Israeli military forces launched a renewed invasion of the Gaza Strip, as a result of which it was not just formally the occupying power, but began also to reestablish direct physical control of increasing Gaza Strip territory. There are two areas that it has not yet fully controlled. One is the main city in the Gaza Strip, the ancient Gaza City, and the other is what's known as a central region, which mainly the city of Deir al-Balah, its three surrounding refugee camps of Nusayrat, Al-Burej, and Al-Maghazi, and to the south of that, the so-called humanitarian zone of Al-Mawasi. Now, the Israeli cabinet last week adopted a decision to fully occupy Gaza City, and then thereafter, as the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu indicated in this press conference, to also establish its control over the central area and then Al-Mawasi. Israel's stated objectives are basically to depopulate Gaza City, where perhaps up to 800,000 Palestinians remain, and to seek to eliminate the remaining Palestinian guerrilla forces in that area, Hamas and others, and to then move progressively southward. Now, you may recall that beginning in mid-March of this year, when Israel unilaterally repudiated, excuse me, the agreement reached in January and launched Operation Gideon's Chariots, Israel had indicated at the time that this was a kind of final offensive, as a result of which it would achieve total victory. Well, that didn't happen, and now we have this new operation, and its objectives appear to be to push the remaining population increasingly south in order to concentrate them in a camp on the Palestinian side of Gaza's border with Egypt, the Rafah area, and to then systematically reduce to rubble what has not yet been destroyed in those areas it seizes control of. And I think the broader objective here, which has been repeatedly enunciated by Israeli leaders and senior officials and hangers on and so on, is to force the population of the Gaza Strip permanently out of the Gaza Strip by hook or by crook. Ideally, there would be one massive push of all of them into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, but this is something that has been categorically rejected by Egypt and indeed by every other state in the region. And so Israel appears to be seeking to create a reality of social collapse, of chaos and anarchy that will put Palestinians in a position similar to that of Syrians a decade ago, where they leave not because of a government decision to collectively expel them on a particular date, but rather that the conditions of life within the Gaza Strip become so untenable as a result of the conditions created by Israel that growing numbers of them will seek to leave in order to save their own skins and then that of their families. This, of course, is known as voluntary emigration in Israeli parlance, rather than forced expulsion. So that, I think, is a general picture. Now, there are two complications for Israel. The first is that Palestinians in the northern Gaza Strip appear not to be particularly keen on leaving that area, both because they know that if they leave, it's their final departure, it's permanent, and they'll never be allowed back. But just as importantly, they have no safe passage because those that do leave are constantly sniped and bombarded and so on. And even when they arrive in what are advertised as safe areas further in the south, those refugee tents are bombed and strafed on a daily basis as well. So many of them may well decide, well, if this is going to happen to us anyway, we might as well remain in the comparative comfort of our own homes as opposed to a flimsy tent on the seaside that can either get bombed by the Israelis or washed away by the next storm. And Israel, in addition to that, is using the weapon of hunger, of starvation, of famine to seek to accelerate this process of forced relocation.
It's striking that it's Israel's stated intent to remove the Palestinian population of Gaza. And Donald Trump, the president of the hegemon, obviously Israel completely depends on the US, has endorsed this plan, made clear he supports this plan. I know there's been inconsistencies, that always is with Trump in terms of his approach, but that has been clear. A former Israeli prime minister said, and I don't want to go down this is true because an Israeli politician says it when we know it's true, but, Ehud Olmert is a former member of Likud and a close ally of Ariel Sharon. Olmert says they're building a concentration camp. And the Israeli lawyer who defended Israel at the International Court of Justice against charges of genocide has said it would be a crime against humanity and a war crime, and signed a letter saying it could be genocidal. Now, Israeli intent all the way through the genocide has been suppressed in both the Western media and amongst Western politicians. It's like it's happening in another universe, like it's not really happening. That intent, which is so explicit, is just not reported. You read these news articles about Israel's latest strategy and none of that is there. It's just not foregrounded. It's as if it's not actually happening.
It's quite incredible. It's I think the lawyer you're referring to was E.L. Benvenisti. It was basically, this is almost like a defense lawyer in a criminal trial accusing his client of being guilty of the murder for which he's being put on trial, and still, everyone else saying no, he's innocent. So it's quite incredible. Just one point about President Trump. It's not so much that he's only authorized this Israeli initiative. Yes, Israeli leaders have repeatedly proposed it publicly and privately since October of 2023. The United States, during the Biden years, tried to sell it to the Arab states who categorically rejected it. But what's new here is that Trump, in February of this year, publicly announced it not as an Israeli plan that he would support, but as an American initiative. And so, while it's a harebrained scheme that the Americans appear now to have reconsidered and no longer really talk about, what it did crucially is it legitimized Israel's own intentions in this regard, so that now when Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders get in front of the microphones, they don't talk about, we want to expel these Palestinians from the Gaza Strip because we don't want them here and all the rest of that. I say, no, our policy is to implement President Trump's vision. And so, that is an important difference because, of course, the United States, particularly under this administration, I mean, you look at what they're doing in Brazil, for example, and of course with the International Criminal Court, will stop at nothing to seek to beat down any government that stands up to Israel. And so, in that sense, I think it's important that the Israelis are able to present it as an American initiative rather than one of their own.
There's a reported schism between the Israeli political leadership and the Israeli military leadership. The IDF are basically briefing that they're opposed to it, not because they care about the Palestinian people. That's not their issue. It's interesting because in an Israeli newspaper a few days ago, the wife of the former chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, said that on October the 7th, he told her Gaza will be destroyed. Just another example of Israeli genocidal intent, private and public. But what do you make of it? Because at the IDF, they're briefing, they don't like the plan, they don't want the plan. And at the same time, Bezalel Smotrich, one of the more extreme genocidal fanatics in the Israeli government, said on the other side, he's not supporting the plan because it doesn't go far enough. What do you make of all these schisms?
Well, there's three concurrent debates taking place within Israeli political circles and more broadly within Israel about this latest plan. The first objections come from those who are even more to the extreme right than Netanyahu, Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and the like. And what the concern, if I can put it that way, that they have expressed is that the government did not adopt a decision for the immediate and full reoccupation of the entire Gaza Strip, the destruction of whatever remains standing in the Gaza Strip, the expulsion of Palestinians who remain in the Gaza Strip, and the intensified use of humanitarian supplies explicitly as a weapon of war in order to starve the Palestinians into submission. And the reason they oppose this is what they say, that their fear is that the government has also not explicitly and categorically rejected the possibility of a renewed agreement by which there would be a captive exchange and potentially the genocidal military campaign brought to an end. So their concern is that the government may not be serious about this offensive and may be using it as leverage in order to see if it can generate further concessions from the Palestinians around the negotiating table, rather than basically annihilate the Gaza Strip. The second one comes from the military leadership. As you probably know, Israel is not a particularly big country. It's not a particularly large society. Its military is fairly small in size. It relies primarily on superior weaponry and superior technology to fight its wars. And its military doctrine is that the wars Israel fights must be short, decisive, and fought on enemy territory. Israel has now been mired in the Gaza Strip for almost 2 years. Its men are exhausted. It is experiencing shortages of materiel and resources. There is growing dissension among reservists who feel that they are having to serve in the military and be away from their work and their families and so on, while another sector of Israeli society, the ultra-Orthodox, are basically given formal consent not to serve in the Israeli military. And so the military leadership, or at least very significant parts of it, including the current chief of staff, who was handpicked by Netanyahu, so is hardly a left-wing dissident, they are not too keen on this offensive because they feel it will unnecessarily strain the Israeli military beyond what it can bear. Also, bearing in mind, that Gaza may not be the only front Israel has to fight on, and there's a broader issue that all the remaining Israeli captives in the Gaza Strip are soldiers, and I believe that the military leadership is also concerned about the message that is being sent to current and prospective members of the Israeli military that, if you get captured and you're being held in the Gaza Strip or Lebanon or anywhere else, your government is going to prioritize continuing a forever war against that enemy over doing everything within its power to retrieve you and ensure that you are brought back home. And this ties into the third debate, which is that within Israeli society, where it seems that a growing proportion of Israeli public opinion supports an agreement with the Palestinians that would not only result in an exchange of captives, but also an end to the war, because they believe, I don't agree with them, but many of them believe that the war is being continued by Netanyahu primarily for personal or political motives. In other words, to stall the legal cases against him, to keep his coalition together, and so on. And they see a direct contradiction between continuing to prosecute the genocidal military campaign on the one hand, or reaching an agreement on the other, because the argument is that the only way you're going to get these captives back, or at least get them back alive, is through an agreement. And if you reject an agreement, you're essentially sentencing them to death, or at least indefinite captivity. So those are kind of the three debates that are being held. What I find telling is that, perhaps in contrast to previous periods, one argument you're not hearing against this intensified genocidal military campaign is that we shouldn't do this because of international pressure. It's quite telling that no one in the Israeli leadership feels that there is a serious prospect of international sanctions or of international pressure against Israel that should lead them to reconsider. There's a kind of a understanding that foreign powers may criticize, may even condemn, may even announce this or that, but that's for public consumption. That's political theater. And one thing Israel won't have to worry about is meaningful consequences for its actions.
It's interesting in terms of just talking, obviously, about the famine. Obviously, the United Nations-backed IBC said that the famine is in full swing in Gaza. They said that about 2 weeks ago. And, the likes of Smotrich, though, the far-right minister, Netanyahu, a few months ago, were talking about the dangers of images of starving Palestinians, the impact that could have in terms of Western allies, including Republican senators who were privately fretting over the impact. And yet, here we are. They've presided over Palestinians starving to death in front of cameras. I mean, do you think that's having an effect? Do you think they did think it would have an impact? They were briefing, they were worried. Do you think it will have an impact?
Well, it hasn't had an impact. There were indeed concerns it was having an impact, and that also explains why Israel didn't just simply prohibit the existing aid agencies from working and seek to expel them from the Gaza Strip, prevent them from bringing supplies into the Gaza Strip, but instead set up this sham alternative, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has now been characterized by Doctors Without Borders as a campaign of orchestrated killing and dehumanization of the supposed recipients. I mean, it's probably one of the most Orwellian named organizations in the 21st century. And in addition to this, Israel has launched a well-orchestrated propaganda campaign seeking to basically dismiss any of these images that you mentioned as somehow being fake. So most famously, we had this picture of a mother holding an emaciated child reduced to skin and bones, who was also suffering from cerebral palsy. but had not appeared to be malnourished prior to the intensified siege and famine. And somehow, this is. I mean, it's almost eugenics in full force. The propaganda line is that this child has a genetic disorder, and therefore you can't blame starvation for him being reduced to skin and bones. Whereas we have pictures of him where he's not skin and bones, and it's almost as if, you know, this kid has cerebral palsy. What's the big deal? He deserves to die, and as if, it's not common knowledge that in conditions of malnourishment, starvation, and famine, it's of course the weakest and most vulnerable that get affected first, that die first. The very young, infants who cannot yet eat food while their mothers can no longer produce milk, or baby formula is unavailable. The very old with chronic conditions who require special care and medication, and every other famine on record, those are the people who die first, and then it progresses gradually to the more healthy and the more resilient.
On Sunday, the Israeli army murdered Anas al-Sharif. He was an Al Jazeera correspondent, a very famous correspondent, one of the most famous people in Gaza who was alive, as well as 4 of his Al Jazeera colleagues in a strike on their tent. And it was just moments after he posted saying the occupation is threatening a full-scale invasion. And he said, if this madness does not end, Gaza will be reduced to ruins, its people's voices silenced, their faces erased, and history will remember you as silent witnesses to a genocide you chose not to stop. He said silence is complicity. I mean, do you think it's linked? It seems very clear this is linked to the latest plans. Israel's already, of course, overseen the biggest slaughter of journalists ever recorded in the history of human civilization. And now they're choosing to kill, they're removing the final witnesses, the final prominent witnesses with big platforms to make sure those atrocities can't be seen.
So I'd make several points. The first is, as you noted, Gaza is the most dangerous place on earth to be a journalist. Or, as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres remarked already a long time ago, Gaza is also the most dangerous place on earth to be a child. We could add to that, Gaza is also the most dangerous place to be an aid worker. Gaza is also the most dangerous place on earth to be a medical professional, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in this specific case, Israel has already killed more than 200 journalists, many of them as a result of deliberately targeted assassinations. And it has been inciting against Anas al-Sharif for a very long time, I believe for well over a year. And it has been warning him to stop his work as a reporter for a long time. And quite clearly, it has had the capacity to kill him for a very long time. And given that he was killed along with 4 other journalists in a tent that was clearly identified as belonging to journalists just outside Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, quite clearly this was not a case where Israel was in any way concerned about killing others along with him. So the first question that needs to be asked is, why now? Why didn't they do this last month or a year ago or in October? And the reason, to me, it seems quite clear, is precisely because they needed to remove one of the most active witnesses to what they're about to do. This renewed and intensified campaign in Gaza City that we're talking about. And bear in mind, Al Jazeera is the most well-resourced media operation that's still in the Gaza Strip. It has multiple correspondents, videographers, and so on. So it's able to provide live 24/7 coverage. And that's why Al Jazeera in particular has been, and Al Jazeera Arabic in particular, has been repeatedly targeted over the past 2 years. I mean, without Al Jazeera, this would be much less of a live streamed genocide. So what I think distinguishes the case of Anas al-Sharif is that Israel immediately, loudly and proudly took full responsibility for his killing. They didn't even try to pretend he was, he wasn't our target and was killed by mistake, or he was killed by a rival Palestinian, or immediately said he was our target, and then immediately he began with the misinformation and the fabrications and the so on. He was a he was a commander in a Hamas rocket unit. He was this, he was that. And Israel puts out all these fabricated documents and statements that are not even internally consistent. For example, one document they put out claimed that already before October 2023, he was supposedly severely injured in a military training accident and was therefore decommissioned. But at the same time, claiming that he was at the time he was killed, he was actively the commander of a Hamas cell. So just and the reason that I think Israeli propaganda in such cases has become so sloppy and incompetent is because Israel knows that anything and everything it says is going to be reported as serious news by the Western media. And that if there is going to be scrutiny, it'll be in 6 weeks or 6 months from now. And by that time, the idea that this guy was, in Israel's words, a terrorist operating disguised as a journalist will have done its work. Because once again, Israel's purpose here is not to convince you of its story, but to sow sufficient doubt and confusion that you or I will feel uncomfortable confidently stating in public, this man was a journalist and Israel had absolutely no right to harm him in any way. And to do so was a despicable crime for which it must be held accountable. If you and I and others have sufficient doubt about what is really going on, Israel will have achieved its purpose, even if you also are very skeptical about its story. And of course, Israel's handmaidens in such cases are the Western press and the Western media who report this as serious news, knowing full well that Israel has consistently lied and prevaricated and fabricated in such cases without pointing that out, without demanding that Israel provide evidence, and clearly pointing out that there is none, and so on. And we've now reached a stage where merely being a Palestinian journalist is considered sufficient proof that one is somehow guilty of a capital offense. And on the one hand, aspersions are cast on Palestinian journalists for no reason other than they being Palestinian journalists, despite the exceptionally heroic work they've been doing under impossible circumstances for 2 years, while at the same time, Israel prevents foreign journalists from entering the Gaza Strip. So, from Israel's perspective, it's a win-win situation. You can't trust what the people there are saying, and we won't let anyone else in to verify what they're saying.
Very, very astute point about how Israel's strategy is often, when it commits atrocities, the Western media will portray it as who knows what's what in the fog of war. As long as it's done that, it's achieved its goal. I mean, just a couple of other things. One is about growing numbers of Western states who are recognizing the Palestinian state. A growing number of Western states are recognizing it. The latest is Australia. France says it will recognize Palestine in the autumn. There's Britain's ludicrous statement saying it would conditionally back a two-state solution unless Israel agrees to a ceasefire and a two-state solution process, which is totally contradictory. But in any case, what do you make of it? How significant is it? Does it mean anything?
Well, I think we need to start by noting that the overwhelming majority of the international community already recognized the state of Palestine decades ago, mainly in the late 1980s, when it was first proclaimed by the PLO at the height of the First Intifada, when most of the world's governments recognized the state of Palestine unconditionally. The West has been a different story. With the exception of Sweden in 2014, no Western state has recognized the state of Palestine prior to the Gaza genocide. Last May, Norway, Ireland, and Spain recognized Palestine. Then they were followed in June by Slovenia. And what we're seeing now is a growing number of Western states either recognizing Palestine or announcing an intention to recognize the state of Palestine at the upcoming 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in New York next month. What got the ball rolling was a French initiative a few months ago when France and Saudi Arabia were together organizing this conference at UN headquarters in New York about promoting a two-state settlement. And French President Emmanuel Macron announced that he was considering recognizing Palestine, and also indicated that he wanted to do this in close coordination with Britain and Canada. All three of them are members of the G7, and France and Britain are also permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. And France, of course, is a leading member of the European Union. So that would have been quite significant. Then I believe Britain and Canada basically didn't commit. Then Israel launched its unprovoked war against Iran. So the New York conference was indefinitely shelved. But then it was convened again last month. And first, France, rather than waiting for London and Ottawa, unilaterally said that it would act alone. And that seems to have generated sufficient pressure on Canada and Britain to follow suit. And then others indicated they would do the same. And most recently, Australia, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said Australia would be recognizing Palestine next month. And New Zealand is apparently now considering a similar action, while making clear that as far as Wellington is concerned, recognition of Palestine is a matter of when and not if. So the dam has burst in terms of the West catching up with the rest of the world and Western states formally recognizing the state of Palestine. And I don't think we can or should dismiss this as insignificant political theater. Yes, it is first and foremost a symbolic political gesture, but symbolic gestures can be very politically significant. The issue here, as was pointed out, I think, very perceptively by Zenaida Miller in a recent opinion piece in the New York Times, and also by Noura Harakat in an article of her own, is that what does it mean to, first of all, offer recognition or proclaim an intent to recognize the state of Palestine, while at the same time attaching multiple conditions to that recognition, then saying the reason you are proceeding to recognition is in order to promote a two-state settlement, while at the same time doing absolutely nothing to directly confront Israel's genocidal policies in the West Bank and and genocidal policies in the Gaza Strip and annexationist policies in the West Bank. So under those circumstances, you are essentially left with nothing more than symbolic political theater. So I would argue, the issue is not whether one looks at these acts of recognition positively or negatively, but the key criteria should be, what are they accompanied or unaccompanied with? If it's simply, we've recognized and that's it, well, it's not going to do anyone any good. If it is a question of, we are doing this because have decided that we need to use the leverage that we know we have to begin to compel Israel to behave like a state that respects civilized norms of conduct. We're going to hold it accountable. Impunity ends here. Then it could be a potentially valuable first step. But we're way past the point where recognition in and of itself is going to make a difference. And one last point, I think it's quite clear that domestic political calculations played an important role in these decisions. Of course, Israel and its apologists are now up in arms about the so-called Muslim vote, as if, also playing into this Islamophobic environment of, well, all these politicians are just prostrating themselves before Allah and the Muslim vote and whatever. No, as you well know, the anti-genocide constituency in Western states has become so comprehensive that Muslims are arguably a minority in it. And the fear here is that this high-profile symbolic gesture is intended to divert the attention of constituents from real and meaningful and concrete measures to address the horrific realities on the ground.
And just finally, on what you mentioned there, I mean, that's something which obviously gets so eclipsed by the genocidal annihilation of Gaza. In the West Bank, there's been pogrom after pogrom, a systematic campaign by the Israeli state to annex, expand settlements, remove Palestinians from their homes, terrorize them, make their lives unlivable. What's going on in the West Bank?
Well, I think we can look at the West Bank as kind of the Gaza Strip in slow motion. We've had the largest forced displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank since 1967. Tens of thousands, I think between 40 and 50,000 Palestinians forced out of their homes and communities in the northern West Bank, primarily Jenin, Tulkarem, and Tubas. And the Israelis are gradually working their way southwards. And I think it's crucial to understand that what will determine the future course of Israeli activity in the West Bank is the extent to which it can continue in the Gaza Strip with impunity. In other words, if it is allowed to do as it pleases in the Gaza Strip, then it will conclude, quite rightfully, that it can also do that in the West Bank. If the Arab states or its Western sponsors and allies change course and put a halt to its activities by using the leverage that they do have, whether diplomatic or economic or otherwise, then Israel will think twice. Because Israel, unlike South Africa or Russia or other countries, is entirely dependent on the support of external powers for its colonial actions against the Palestinians. And that's why it's always been extraordinarily sensitive to both public opinion abroad, but even more so government policy and the mood in parliaments and so on. And Israel is known as a country, they don't just kick the door in. They knock on the door, then they open it, they push it in 1 centimeter. And only after they're able to take all these preliminary steps and determine that there isn't going to be any pushback and that they can basically do whatever the hell they want, only then do they kick the door in. And so every action without a reaction lays the basis for a successive and more intense action.
Incredible stuff. Devastating analysis, always absolute tour de force, and all very insightful. Obviously grim, because we're discussing one of the great crimes of our ages as it's ongoing. So those watching, do leave your comments, press like, subscribe to encourage people to listen.
Thank you very much, Owen. It's always a pleasure to be on your program.
Yeah, I just want to say, honestly, always a great, great pleasure. So Mouin, just great, great thanks to you on behalf of everyone watching.
Thank you.